Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Tin Man Collections, and today I'll be reading another chapter out of North Carolina Ghosts Ledges by Nancy Roberts. And this one's called The General's Ghost, and it's over at Fort Fisher. South of Wilmington, there is a peninsula of land between the Cape Fear River and the Atlantic Ocean. The distance between the river and the ocean gradually narrows, and near the tip of the land where the highway ends are the remains of Fort Fisher. This is a haunted land. Mounds of sand with live oak trees twisted among them mark what once was the Gibraltar of the Confederacy. On one side is the ocean, and just beyond the breakers, sometimes at low tide, the skeletons of blockade runners can be seen. There should be many ghosts here. The ghost of the Confederacy is one. For in a sense, what happened here made it die. Moreover, there should be the ghost of the hundreds of men who fought and died in one of the most savage hand-to-hand battles ever waged on this continent. But the ghost seen here is that of a Confederate general, one of the best the Confederacy had. He was William Whiting, born in Mississippi, graduated first in his class at West Point, and former commander of the Division of the Army of Northern Virginia. That guy has some class. Must be top of his class if he made up to a general. But anyway, several years following the end of the war, a group of Confederate veterans who had served at Fort Fisher returned to visit the wrecked fort. They lingered longer than they had planned, recalling memories of the great battle and still blaming General Bragg for not coming to their aid. As the shadow stretched across the parapets, they were startled to see the figure of a Confederate officer climb into a gun emplacement on the land side of the fort where the old Wilmington Road wandered through the trees to the fort entrance. I'll be kind of startled if I saw somebody climbing in a gun thing, even though it ain't nobody there. But anyway, for a moment, they thought another veteran had come to join them, although they weren't expecting an officer dressed in Confederate uniform. They watched spellbound as the officer mounted the parapet, gazed in the direction of the old road, and then, as they started toward him, vanished. And like I said, if that happened to me, I'll be like, okay, we better get out of here. I'll be like spooked to death. But anyway, each one of the half dozen men knew what the others were thinking. It was the ghost of Little Billy, as he had been affectionately called by the men who had known him. For several moments there was silence, and then one of the veterans said, "That's the same spot where he was wounded." Another added, "It's a shame they had to take him to a prison up north to die." On the trip back to Wilmington, nothing else was said. During the years of Reconstruction, other veterans visited the fort. They didn't talk much about the ghost or what they saw there, but this is not uncommon with men after the war is over. Today, if you go to Fort Fisher and you don't see the general in gray, it is not because he isn't there. If the wind is blowing in front, the sea and the breakers are crashing over the timbers of the wrecked ships, you may not hear his footsteps. But wait until dusk, and in the shadows of the fort, you will sense he is nearby. Let me tell you what happened there. Although the war, Wilmington had been the favorite port for the blockade runners, bringing in supplies which the Confederacy so desperately needed, and carrying cotton back to England to get the hard cash to hold the southern economy intact. But as the war went on, the other ports of the Confederacy were closed one by one, either through capture by Union forces or the growing strength of the Union fleet. By the end of 1864, Wilmington was the only port left open between the Confederacy and the outside world. I didn't know that, but anyway. And it was protected by the Gibraltar of the South, Fort Fisher. The fort had been built out of sand, marsh grass, pine timbers, and the imagination and skill of its commanding officer, Colonel William Lamb. Colonel Lamb took command of the fort on July 4th, 1862, when it amounted to nothing, and 2 years later had a fort of such strength that the Union fleet dared not to come too close to the entrances of the river. Happy were the blockade runners when they came within range of the fort's guns, for the pursuing Yankee ships were then forced to turn back. Fort Fisher became such a problem for the Union that President Lincoln, pacing the corridors of the White House in Washington, finally made the ultimate decision to send practically the entire Atlantic fleet and the best of his troops against it. In December of '64, General Lee's aides brought word that the Union was gathering a great armada of ships to attack Fort Fisher. General Lee had written that so long as the port of Wilmington remained open, his army had a chance. But Lee knew Colonel Lamb and his 36th North Carolina Regiment stationed at the fort were no match for the force the Union was about to hurl against them. Despite Lee's own shortage of troops, he immediately dispatched General Robert F. Oak and 6,000 of his veteran troops to Fort Fisher. These troops would be placed under the general command of the Department of Wilmington, which roughly embraced all the Confederate defenses along the river. Man, that's a lot of soldiers. But anyway, unfortunately, Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president, chose this moment to send one of his favorite generals to take command of the area. From General Whiting, sentiment in the South was summed up by one line in a Richmond newspaper which said, "Bragg has been sent to command the troops at Wilmington. Goodbye, Wilmington." The Union commander of the invasion fleet was also most unpopular in the South. General Benjamin Butler, called Beast Butler, landed his troops a few miles up the beach out of range of the guns of the fort. It was his plan after the mass shelling by the Union fleet to move his troops and take the fort. Oh, and here's a picture of, I don't know if you can see it, of the ghost general standing there. While a Union gunboats blazed incessantly at the fort, a young Confederate fell into the hands of Butler's pickets. The captured soldier casually mentioned that Hoke and his men were on their way to save the fort. Upon hearing the news, General Butler quickly surveyed the fort and decided his position was precautious. He immediately ordered a retreat back to the beach. Butler may not have been the first man off the beach, but he was certainly not the last. His army left in such haste that they forgot an entire brigade leaving it on the beach that night. In the morning, through the efforts of the Navy, the brigade was rescued, and Butler and his fleet returned to North in humiliation. General Bragg had staged an elaborate review of Hoke's troops for the citizens of Wilmington, and then had ordered Hoke's men to dig in at a place called Sugar Loaf. About 8 miles up the peninsula, Bragg himself set up his headquarters at Sugar Loaf with Hoke and his men, several batteries of artillery, and about 1,500 North Carolina reserves. After the first attack on the fort failed, General Bragg congratulated both Whiting and Lamb for their successful defense. However, these same officers were not lulled into epiphany by the praise of the commanding general. They appealed for more guns, men, and ammunition. Lamb and Whiting knew the Federals would be back with more men and ships for another try. General Bragg did not agree. Lincoln replaced Butler with a company general, and on January 12, 1865, Colonel Lamb mounted the ramparts of his fort and saw the most formidable fleet that ever floated on the sea, supplemented by transports carrying 8,500 men. That is a lot of soldiers, I tell you. But anyway, this time the fleet began an immediate and intense bombardment on the fort, which in the colonel's words was beyond description. The bombardment continued day and night. The Confederates, short of gunpowder and shells, were ordered by Lamb to fire each gun only once every half hour. That doesn't seem right. I mean, like, you'll be wasting a lot of ammo then. But anyway, when it became apparent to Whiting that Bragg was not going to strongly reinforce the fort, but remain at Sugar Loaf with his army, General Whiting commanded a ship and sailed down the river to Fort Fisher alone. Walking through the bursting shells, he entered the fort and found Colonel Lamb at his post. Above the roar of the guns, he shouted to the colonel, "Lamb, my boy, I have come to share your fate. You and your garrison are to be sacrificed." Lamb could not believe Bragg would desert him and asked, "Where are Hoke's men?" Whiting replied that when he left headquarters, General Bragg has just issued orders for removing his stores and ammunition and was looking for a place to fall back upon. The Federal troops poured ashore onto the beach far enough north to be out of range of the fort's guns. As the blue regiments formed and began their advance, Whiting telegraphed an urgent message to Bragg. The enemy are about to assault. They outnumber us heavily. We are just manning our parapets. Fleet has extended down the sea front outside and firing heavily. Enemy on the beach in front of us in very heavy force, not more than 700 yards from us. Nearly all land guns disabled. Attack. It is all I can say and all you can do. In response to the appeal, Bragg dispatched what he said was 1,100 veteran infantry down the river by a steamer. The ships were fired upon heavily by the Federal guns, and less than half the men reached the fort. Colonel Lamb put the figure at 350 South Carolinians of Johnston Haggett's brigade. Unfortunately, the troops had to run a half-mile under the naval bombardment from the Union guns. They reached the fort out of breath, and Colonel Lamb immediately sent them to an old bomb shelter to rest. This was the last help Lamb was to receive. Yeah, I'll be needing some rest if I was running that hard, but anyway. All at once, the great Union fleet stopped firing and blew the steam whistles. Oh, excuse me, their steam whistles. It was the signal for the final attack at the point where the land and sea faces of the fort joined overlooking the beach. Several thousand Union Marines and sailors charged. Lamb, with a few hundred of his men, threw them back in a fierce hand-to-hand fight. Just as it appeared, this attack was over. 3 Federal battle flags appeared on the ramparts of the fort to the west. 8,000 Federal troops followed these flags. Both Whiting and Lamb gathered what men were left and launched a counterattack. The fighting swirled from gun emplacement to gun emplacement. In the smoke and roar of the battle, a Union officer shouted to Whiting to surrender. Go to hell, Whiting replied. Oh, he's really tough. A moment later, he sank to the sand, mortally wounded. Colonel Lamb, fighting on with a few hundred of his men, was also wounded, and the command fell to Major James Riley, who made the final stand at the last gun emplacement. General Whiting was taken prisoner, and despite his wounds was taken to a Union prison on Governor's Island in New York Harbor, where he died a short time later. The spot where Whiting fell in the battle is unmarked, but go to Fort Fisher at dusk and listen to the wind and the waves, and you may find that the gray-clad figure of the Confederate general still lingers there. The area now is part of a state historical site. Yes, and I was about to say that too, because my family went there to Fort Fisher, and we went there during the daytime, so I did not see any ghost apparitions or any foot knocks or anything happening. So, I mean, hey, I might, if we go back there, I might try to do a ghost investigation, but try not to make anybody angry. But anyway, that's going to be it for this book for now. I'm going to call this quits for these books right now. I got the other Bigfoot book I'm going to read, and then I'm going to call it quits for this year, and then I'll start it up all again next year. So stay tuned for those. But don't forget to like, subscribe, turn on those post notifications, and let me down in the comments what do you think about the story. Okay? Sayonara.